Before we start, be aware that the Callisto Protocol is an ultra-violent gore fest of an M-rated game and was literally banned in Japan. Viewer discretion is advised. Now let's get into it. For the Callisto Protocol, the horror is in the details. This is a game that does everything in its power to be as scary as possible all of the time, and virtually every minor detail of the game is tailored to that end. Objectives are placed near enemies and hazards that leave you paranoid of if you're in actual danger. Loot is laid out in very deliberate ways, which draws the attention of the player and baits them into traps. Even opening chests and lockers has been made up into a tense toss-up. Will you find those bullets or healing that you desperately needed? Or will you get jumped by a parasite only to lose more of the few resources that you had? The lighting in the game is also used masterfully throughout, and to similar ends as the visible loot, but we'll talk more about that in visual design. Unfortunately, the game can also struggle with its tone as a result, being that the game is always pushing a tone of horrific high tension and never comes back down outside of select cutscenes. If the game is literally always scary, then the player will have one of potentially two reactions. Either they will always be scared, or, more than likely, they will eventually never be scared. If the game's tension never comes down and the player is never given time to truly relax, then a sense of normalcy is never re-established and the high tension becomes the game's norm and what the player expects. This isn't helped by the lack of variety in the dangers that the player will face. While of course the player will have no shortage of environmental hazards to avoid, like the infamous gear room or the water slide, the elements that actualize a horror game are the enemies the player is made to face and fear. Unfortunately, on that note, this is the entire list of enemies that the player can face in the base game. And of that list, these two are trap enemies that are largely stationary unless a player triggers them, meaning that this is the actual list of enemies that the player will encounter roaming around. To make matters worse, there are only 2 bosses, despite being 5 boss fights, with this one being used 3 separate times and the second one being used twice. Possibly the most tragic of all of these is arguably the scariest enemy in the entire game, which is ironically the least grotesque, the security robot. The player is introduced to them very early and is given a reason to fear them immediately. They are nigh unkillable to the point that killing one actually nets you an achievement, and they will kill you in only a single hit at range. No enemy in the entire game is the player incentivized to fear or avoid more than the security robots, and the reason that this becomes tragic is they are only an actual threat 3 times. This lack of variety and utilization can very quickly lead to the player becoming desensitized to the horrors that they face because the horrors quickly become limited. Depending on the player's emotional state, these can all lead to a critical failure of the game's overall design. If a game whose only goal is to scare the player ceases to be scary, then at that point all you're left with is a viscerally gory action game. It can be argued that almost the entire game is one singular continuous level, and I mean that in the best and worst ways imaginable. On one hand, the entire world feels very cohesive, as though every place the player is made to visit, from the grungy and falling apart prison cell blocks, to the industrial inner workings, to the frozen tundra outside, all belong together, and are believably all in the same place. With very few exceptions, the map of the entire game is very unified in this way, and in the rare times that the game deviates from that unity it establishes, it's only to make a punchline land harder. On the other hand, however, the game is one continuous level in a literal sense. The levels are incredibly linear, to the point where a player can essentially autopilot through much of the game without needing to have a clear understanding of where they need to go or what they need to do. While exploration is almost always rewarded with loot and lore, and even sometimes very handsomely in the form of optional, more powerful new weapons, the opportunities for players to actually explore at all are very few and far between, with each major section of the game having only 1 or 2 dedicated side paths that loop back to the main critical one. Also, while this next point is generally an overall game design thing that would be in the previous section, I really felt the need to mention it in this next point because of the fact that it is so reliant on level design. The game offers almost no way for the player to keep track of their goals, location, or direction. The only way for players to refer to what they're supposed to be doing is their stated goal in the top left corner of, for some reason, the inventory menu. There is no map to track where you've been, no objective screen, and nothing the player can do to guide themselves to the objective of their own volition. Consequently, the one thing the game does give you then becomes borderline useless, as knowing what your objective is doesn't mean anything if you don't know where you need to go in order to achieve it. What all of this means is that the literal only way the game guides the player whatsoever is through the level and visual design. However, that also means that there's no fallback plan. If either one of those elements ever fails to capture the player's attention, the player will simply get lost with no way of recovering. The Callisto Protocol is infamous for its poor optimization at launch. Frame rates die off almost as quickly as you do, and there are even circumstances where the lag becomes so bad that the game will practically freeze, and the timing for scares is entirely missed. While the devs will inevitably patch it given enough free time after release, that doesn't excuse the fact that the first game launched by a studio made up of nothing but industry veterans launched a game that was borderline unplayable for many people unless they had tech far surpassing the required specifications. Even in circumstances such as mine, where I was playing the game on a PC with over 4 times the visual processing power than the recommended specs, recommended, not minimum, the best I could do was have everything on medium settings or the frame rate would drop by an unacceptable margin. And speaking of the frame rate dying as fast as you do, the very first time I died in the game, it fully crashed. Fortunately, this didn't happen twice, but it certainly painted a poor picture within only the first 40 minutes. The game also tends to have its fair share of animation errors, especially with enemies that have pre-rendered takedown animations, despite the fact they can also have dynamically changing appearances based on the damage you deal to them. With one of the boss monsters, you may be impaled by nothing and then lifted off the ground while levitating over the stump of their hand, and in a particularly noticeable instance, an enemy gouged out my eyes by simply holding the sides of my head and clipping their thumbs into my temples. Very frequently, the game will also struggle with any time that glass is broken, as remnants and shards will remain floating in the air indefinitely and defy gravity as they sit on the windowsills. In a similar vein, a room that the player can very clearly see is empty will spawn an enemy in front of the player the moment that they walk into the door without them so much as even having to crawl out of a vent. For a game whose developer is so fixated on their attention to detail, it's very confusing and concerning how many mistakes manage to slip through the cracks. Fun fact: since you made it halfway down the menu, statistically that means you're part of the 30% that tend to watch the whole video, and that makes you my favorite people. Subscribe to keep being my favorite people, and of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. The story of the Callisto Protocol sees Jacob Lee and his friend Max on their last delivery job working for the United Jupiter Company. However, when they are boarded by the known terrorist Danny Nakamura, they crash land on Callisto, leaving Max dead and Jacob wrongfully imprisoned, with the warden of Black Iron Prison seemingly wanting him alive for mysterious reasons. Following an outbreak that begins turning inmates into monsters, he meets Elias, the only kind prisoner, and the two escape together. Meanwhile, Jacob runs into Danny, who also managed to survive the crash, and the two eventually work together as unlikely allies for the sake of surviving and getting off of Callisto. When their escape fails, they uncover the source of the mutations and the conspiracy to use them as a method to evolve humanity. They then resolve to stop the spread and get revenge on the Warden of Black Iron. The end. If it sounds like I'm skipping a few things, essentially every gap you can think of can be filled with, and then more horror happens. There are no real character arcs to speak of whatsoever, save for Jacob having an acceptance of responsibility moment at the end of the game that spurs him into action and heroism when confronting the Warden. He is established as a person who has a heart for those around him, as he is haunted by Max's death throughout the game and becomes enraged with Danny after she violently removes the core unit out of the neck of someone he cared about. However, he is also haunted by the hallucination of Captain Ferris after his death, so it's more likely that this has nothing to do with his being a caring human being that's being affected by the trauma of his circumstances, and instead is a lingering mystery of how his core unit is messing with his head, which gets no payoff. Danny seemingly does grow as a character for most of the game. She first views Jacob as a target, then as a tool that she has to tolerate using, then as a begrudging ally, and eventually as someone that she can trust. Her whole starting motivation revolves around her having tracked down the source of the mutations that destroyed the populace of the neighboring Europa to a bioweapon that was stored as cargo aboard Jacob's ship. Once they track down the ship and Jacob reveals his cargo to have simply been bulk medical supplies, she then begins her arc of slowly learning to trust in Jacob, and instead her motivation then shifts to getting answers from, and later revenge on, the Warden of Blackiron. This is a fine if simple character, were it not for the fact that every single change her character undergoes is completely undermined by the fact that she was actually right all along. In a practically retroactive twist, Jacob is forced to remember back to when he was inspecting the medical supplies destined for Europa, only to find the secret compartment housing the bioweapons. While Jacob had no idea what the bioweapon was at the time, the fact remains that everything Danny believed about him being the one to deliver the weapon to Europa and destroy it was correct, and Jacob is the villain that she thought he was all along, even if he doesn't realize it. Likewise, Jacob's motivation is simply to escape with his life, until it suddenly isn't, because Danny said so. We later learn why Danny is so invested in stopping what happened at Blackiron when we see what really happened to her on Europa, but Jacob has no such thing. Probably no more than 20 minutes after their escape attempt fails, Danny immediately shifts gears, demanding answers, which again, is in line with her motivation, but makes no sense for Jacob whatsoever. This happens before Jacob is ever made to realize that he had any part in this, and at no point has he been shown to just be a naturally curious or inquisitive person. In fact, he's been shown to be the opposite. Someone who is quick to write things off or explain things away, like he did when he immediately accepted what the news said about Danny's terrorist group without a second thought. Yet after only putting up a very brief argument with her demanding to know what's so much more important than escaping, he simply drops everything, relents, and follows her instead of trying to get back to the tower and just disabling the anti-air guns. Worse yet, the fact remains that Max's death, the event that haunts Jacob for the entirety of the story and then forces him to search the details of Danny's memories to realize his own guilt, wasn't even his fault. It's Danny's. Her group was the one that boarded the ship that created the scenario that caused it to crash in the first place. Whether the player is meant to sympathize with her or not, Danny is still a terrorist, even if she wasn't the one to orchestrate the attack on Europa, and Jacob suffers the consequences of that. All of that, combined with the fact that Jacob blaming himself for events he could never have predicted even if he had opened the weapon capsule, is irrational, makes the heroic atonement play he makes to save Danny in the end both hollow and undeserved for both characters. Ultimately, the best purpose this game's story will serve is to establish loose ends and mysteries at the end that pay off in either DLC or the next game, which, if that's the case, it may as well be a wiki article that you read before buying the next one. The Callisto Protocol isn't a mechanically intense game, and yet it's one with a lot to break down. The important mechanics of the game revolve around the combat system and certain unique mechanics used by enemies. Traversal really has nothing to speak of mechanically this time around, as most of the game's traversal is simply holding forward, with the rare exception of needing to break an open vent using your grip. The combat is a brutally heavy brawler with some shooting thrown in, almost the literal inverse of how the game's spiritual predecessor, Dead Space, worked. Except for the iconic Schofield Stomp. That's exactly the same. Always stomp your bodies, kids, they aren't dead unless they drop an item. You have your standard melee attack, a heavy melee attack designed to hit multiple enemies away from you, the Stomp, a handful of different guns, all of which serve roughly the same purpose of hitting weak points or enemies that are too far away to melee, a stealth instant takedown, and your Grip, which is the stand-in for Dead Space's Kinesis and functions almost exactly the same, and two different defensive options, dodging and blocking. Everything I just mentioned, save for the dodge and the stomp, can be upgraded through short skill trees pertaining to that particular thing. Each gun can be made to deal more damage or deal damage in another way, your telekinetic grip gauntlet can increase in charge and efficiency, and your melee weapon can be improved in damage output, damage reduction from blocking, and be given special abilities like extending combos, sweeping legs, or guard breaking. Dodging is the most essential skill to learn, as without it, the player is doomed to die, and die again, in which case, enemies will eventually begin to despawn in order to allow the player to proceed outside of boss fights. The melee combat and gunplay are also jointly integrated with one another, as once you finish a combo and stagger an enemy, you'll be shown a reticle which allows you to quickly draw your weapon and shoot them as a combo finisher. This, along with the guard break, is the primary way that the player can dismember enemies. It's also the primary answer to the unique mechanic that nearly all enemies will gain over the course of the game: evolution. When an enemy receives enough damage, they will spout tentacles from their body as they attempt to rapidly alter themselves to be better equipped for the fight. If left unchecked, the enemy will rip damaged body parts off and regenerate, putting them back to full health, reducing the damage that they take with additional layers of flesh, and increasing damage by altering their limbs into more proper weapons. The player can stop this instantly by landing a clean shot on the area that the tentacles are spouting from, which will instantly kill the enemy. The other unique mechanic comes as a result of the Blind, a form of infected that are older, stronger, and only respond to sound. The player must sneak around them or risk alerting the horde. This is achieved predominantly by the use of your grip to throw loose objects and distract them, and then sneak attack any one of them that gets too far away from the pack. However, what hurts the game's mechanical integrity is a lack of internal consistency. Using the Blind as the most immediate example, on 2 separate occasions I made mistakes that revealed significant flaws in the Blind's ability to hear you. First, I accidentally did the insta-kill on one right next to another one, which, regardless of being called a sneak attack, is decisively unstealthy considering how much noise the kill causes between the carnage and the roaring of the creature, and so I expected to die to the other one immediately. Instead, nothing happened. For some reason, despite the amount of noise that the sneak attack causes, the creatures that only respond to sound never seemed to notice, meaning that in reality, the player can just insta-kill all of them with reckless abandon. Second, I stomped right next to one of them because of a misinput, which is when I learned that Jacob is apparently a wizard who can stomp hard enough to turn giant monsters into paste, and yet apparently also does so completely silently, as again, the creatures that specialize in noticing sound notice nothing. The knowledge that the player can just silently insta-kill every blind they come across unfortunately takes them from being one of the scariest parts of the entire game to just becoming a loot factory which players can use to fill their inventory with credits and bullets. The strong attack that the player unlocks for the stun baton is also practically useless. The thing which makes it unique is its ability to hit multiple enemies at once, as opposed to your normal melee that can only target one enemy at a time. This makes it purpose-built as a get-off-me tool when you're being overwhelmed by multiple enemies at once. This is great, and something that Jacob could definitely use, except that he can't. Because when you're being overrun by multiple enemies, you never ever want to use this attack. Because it's a strong attack, it has a large wind-up window before the attack comes out. However, Jacob never gets any armor or invincibility during this time, meaning that he's just got a very large window where multiple enemies in front of him can hit and interrupt him. This not only doesn't accomplish the goal of what the attack is meant to do, but also does the exact opposite by costing the player more health instead of saving them. Following this trend, the ability to sweep an enemy's legs out from under them after you block an attack sometimes just doesn't work outright, because counter to Jacob, most enemies do get armor that allows them to tank your attacks as long as they are in an attack animation as well. This means that if they don't stop attacking you after hitting your block, all that happens is that their attack and yours will trade, and they won't even be knocked down for it. Lastly, dodging doesn't work the exact way it says it does, and yes, I made absolutely sure after the debacle that happened with my review of Sonic Frontiers in terms of the whole parrying thing, because they're described in almost the exact same way. Quote, "There isn't a timing window. Just be holding left or right before an enemy hits you." And it goes on to say that in order to dodge a string of attacks, you only need to repeat this process by alternating sides. Inputting the same direction twice in a single attack string will cause you to get hit instead. That being said, the dodge does work this way in a vacuum with an asterisk attached. It seems that whenever you attack, there is a window during which you cannot transition from the attack animation to the dodge animation fast enough to not get hit. If you're being aggressive or button mashing, you may very well still get hit even if the dodge animation happens. Likewise, another thing that can cause it to fail is if the player has nowhere to dodge to. In one particular instance, I was put into a corner and died because there was nowhere for the dodge to go. However, if you never attack or shoot and you pay attention to where you're going, the dodging does work as intended, which creates the worst problem of all. It makes you untouchable. Once you master the art of holding left or right and never fighting back, Jacob becomes Neo, and all worry and tension in regard to the gruesome enemies or the brutal death scenes becomes completely null and void. The visual design of the game is concretely one of the best things about it, from the unique way that Striking Distance modeled the enemies by altering existing human models, to the hyper-realistic faces and animations, to the spectacular use of lighting throughout. Lighting is a key design component used throughout the game to inform the player about anything the developers want you to know. Lighting is most often used as a guide, something which contrasts surroundings and attaches itself to the level design in order to attract players to specific places or along certain paths. It can be used to lead players based on where they need to go to progress. It can be used to lure players into scares. And because the devs have such a strong grasp on lighting, it can also be subverted, such as deliberately hiding loot-rich side paths in areas that are more dimly lit, and as such where the player is less inclined to check, and in a specifically great example with this guard robot that very nearly killed me. In a twist, the well-lit area that you should be inclined to go down based on your experience up to this point will just instantly kill you, and the actual way to the critical path is actually along the path that seems less traveled. This experience also conditions the player to explore areas other than those that are the most well lit, especially if they fell for this trap and died to the robot, which will pay off in players seeking out the side paths that will net them extra loot and unlockable weapons, all because of how the game uses lighting. However, one major visual inconsistency is the game's use of its HUD, or lack thereof. Like Dead Space before it, the Callisto Protocol seeks a higher level of immersion by removing the video gamey elements like health bars, radar, a compass, or floating objective icons. The only way the game visually communicates a player's status is by the bars behind Jacob's neck and on the ammo count on the guns themselves. Despite this, the game constantly uses button prompts, icons that indicate objects that are interactable, and of course, the targeting reticle that appears every time Jacob finishes a combo, which all begs the question. In a game with no unjustified HUD elements, where are these elements coming from? And if they can just spawn in and be there, and it's not because of Jacob's helmet or suit, then why can't the player have any form of objective marker or map, both of which would significantly improve the game's flow? The sound design is dedicated to purely that, sound. This is a rare game that, for almost all intents and purposes, has no music, with one exception being the main theme that plays during the end credits. The background ambience shifts based on where you go and what's going on around you. Although, as I said back in the game design section, the game never ceases to be tense. Even in situations where the player has been given no reason to be on guard or afraid, the eerie strings will be quietly shrieking in the background. However, it is also thanks to the sound design that the combat is so weighty and the infamous death animations so devastating, with every hit that Jacob deals being punctuated by the crackle of electricity and the splattering of blood, and every death the tearing of moist flesh and the crunch of shearing bone. If that description made you uncomfortable, good, because that's exactly what it sounds like, and that being uncomfortable means that it's working. There's a lot to unpack here, to the point that I think I might just make my own separate video about it. Opinion score wise, I'll give it a 6. I'd say 6.5, but I don't want to do decimals. I feel like I enjoyed it more than Resident Evil Village, but not more than something like Spider-Man. Naturally, as a Dead Space fan, how I feel about the game is almost entirely a response to comparing the two. Just because the combat is backwards doesn't mean that it feels that much different. The stomp is the same, the awkward and clunky movement is similar, if even stiffer, if you can believe that. Dismemberment is back, but it's completely irrelevant and unimportant. The whole UI design is mostly the same, except it's not justified as being a hologram projected off of Isaac's suit this time. And speaking of visual design stuff, there was one time the UI design just straight up failed for me. And because I had no way of knowing what to do or where to go, I thought I was soft-locked for like 45 minutes because a door gave me no indication that I could interact with it, like literally every other door in the game does. I've been playing games for most of my life, and let me tell you, the last time that I had to read a walkthrough was for Halo Reach. And that wasn't because I needed to, it's because I wanted to, and I was given it as a gift. I can't tell you the last time that I read a walkthrough because I needed to. And yet, infuriatingly, here we are, reading a walkthrough because I'm convinced that the game is broken, but because I don't know what part of it is broken, I can't tell if it's actually broken, or if I'm just an idiot. I hope that you realize how much I really wanted to love this game. I had such high hopes, and for what it's worth, the amount of nostalgia I felt as a Dead Space fan really made me enjoy it a lot more, which is why I can both enjoy it and be so frustrated at the same time. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? Not as fun fact, did you know that according to Steam, less than 3% of players have even bothered beating the Callisto Protocol? It'll show on screen in a second, but yeah. Fun nostalgia? Sure, but disappointing. But hey, we win some, we lose some, and either way I will see you, yes you, next time.